marijuana agenda, like the alcohol agenda. But a lot safer.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja.
We love the herb.
It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Monday, May 15th, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Welcome to the show and welcome to week 3. This is our central rotation, so you'll be hearing some regional reports from the middle of the country this week. Stay tuned for that coming up. On the show today, we have got a visit from Dr. Mitch Earleywine in our Cannabis Q&A segment. All sorts of new studies for us to tell you about, both good and bad. In our Drug War Data Mining segment, we got a roundup of a bunch of polls from New Hampshire, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, plus data from New York City, some demographics on women toking, and some news from the NFL. Then, in our Midwest Cannabis Chronicle debut, we're speaking with Dan Viets from Missouri NORML on the prospects for medical marijuana legalization in 2018, and we'll wind things up with my radical rant opinion piece, Legalization Does Not Invent Cars and Weed, a message for the governor of Vermont, who is currently sitting on a legalization proposal because of his concerns about public safety and traffic following marijuana legalization. That's all coming up in the first hour today on the Marijuana Agenda, followed by Toker Talk Radio in hour 2. But we get things started with the cannabis headline news coming up next, right after this 2-minute break.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Looking for the 420 friendliest way to visit beautiful legal Potland, Oregon?
I'm Lori Duckworth, inviting you to come stay with us at Delta 9 House and Studios.
You get your own private room with queen bed and access to our high-speed Wi-Fi, premium entertainment system, and more.
We'll even cook you breakfast. Look us up on Facebook at Delta 9 House.
That's facebook.com/Delta9House. Delta 9 House is booked through Airbnb and licensed by the City of Portland.
It's time for cannabis facts about teen drug use from Robert Platshorn's thesilvertour.org. This message is supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com. A recent survey by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control indicates that in states that have legalized medical marijuana, the rate of marijuana consumption among high school students has not increased. In fact, in legal states like Colorado, teen use has actually decreased significantly. It's simply no longer a big deal for teenagers in legal states. This was Cannabis Facts from thesilvertour.org, an educational nonprofit supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville with the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 2 weeks for Police for Reform with Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by MarijuanaMoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at MarijuanaMoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News from Monday, May 15th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. As reported by Marijuana Moment's Tom Angel, many members of Congress of both parties are critical of Attorney General Sessions' move to rescind an Obama-era memo intended to reduce mass incarceration. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, said mandatory minimums have, quote, incarcerated too many minorities, which Sessions' policy, quote, will accentuate. Senator Patrick Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, said, quote, this will not make us safer, quite the opposite. Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois, said the policy, quote, flies in the face of the growing bipartisan consensus, end quote, against mass incarceration. Senator Kamala Harris, Democrat of California, said it would, quote, turn back the clock on the progress we've made, end quote. Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, characterized the policy as not, quote, smart on crime, end quote, echoing earlier comments by the author of the rescinded memo, former Attorney General Eric Holder, who called the change, quote, dumb on crime, end quote. In the House, Representative Beto O'Rourke, Democrat of Texas, said Sessions would, quote, double down on failed strategy. Representative Justin Amash, Republican of Michigan, called it an, quote, unjust, ineffective, and costly policy. Representative Keith Ellison, Democrat of Minnesota, called the policy, quote, utterly destructive for low-level nonviolent drug offenders. Representative Steve Cohen, Democrat of Tennessee, said the, quote, beneficiaries of these policies are often private prisons. And Representatives Eleanor Holmes Norton, Democrat of D.C., and Barbara Lee, Democrat of California, both called it an, quote, effort to revive the harshest sentences of the failed war on drugs, end quote. A congressional panel of Philippine lawmakers on Monday found an impeachment complaint against President Rodrigo Duterte lacked substance and should go no further, a widely expected outcome underlying the Maverick leader's steadfast legislative support. Committee members unanimously voted to shoot down the complaint by Gary Alejano, a member of a minority bloc, and will recommend its dismissal by the 292-seat Congress, where Duterte enjoys a supermajority. Alejano accused Duterte of high crimes and betrayal of the public trust by concealing assets, supporting summary executions of thousands of Filipinos in his war on drugs, and having a defeatist approach toward Beijing's assertiveness in the South China Sea. Iowans suffering from a range of diseases and illnesses gain access to medicinal marijuana under a bill signed into law on Friday by Iowa Governor Terry Branstad. The measure, House File 524, expands access to cannabis oil to include patients diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, cancer, multiple sclerosis, seizures, AIDS or HIV, Crohn's disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, as well as most terminal illnesses that involve a life expectancy of less than 1 year and untreatable pain. With Branstad's signature, the law takes effect immediately, making medical marijuana available to potentially thousands more Iowans than under an existing law limited to those with epilepsy. While the newly expanded medical marijuana law in Iowa allows patients to buy the low-dose medication from in-state dispensaries starting December 2018, Iowa residents could look to Minnesota. A provision of a new bill specifically references that state as a potential source of medication and directs Iowa regulators to contract with Minnesota's 2 manufacturers of medical marijuana. It's the first half of an arrangement being worked out between Iowa House Speaker Linda Upmeyer and Minnesota House Speaker Kurt Daudt, friends who first explored the idea last year until the push to expand Iowa's medical marijuana law fizzled out. That arrangement could raise federal concerns. Despite its legal status in nearly 30 states, the federal government still considers medical marijuana a Schedule I drug that can't be moved across state lines. A state lawmaker on Monday is scheduled to unveil the latest piece of legislation that would legalize, regulate, and tax recreational marijuana in New Jersey, and this time he says it has a real shot of becoming law. Governor Chris Christie is staunchly against marijuana, arguing that it's a gateway drug that can lead users to try harder substances, but the senator proposing the bill noted that Christie's final term is up in January, and a new governor will be elected in November. The Frontrunner is Democrat Phil Murphy, who is in favor of legalization. So are the other 5 Democratic candidates for governor. Republican candidates are split. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, May 15th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
At Herbie's Cannabis Seeds, we pride ourselves on bringing you the best quality seeds from the world's most respected cannabis seed producers, all at the lowest online prices. You can find Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. All cannabis seeds are sold as souvenirs and as a means of preserving cannabis genetics. Herbie's Seeds in no way intends to condone, promote, or incite the use of illegal or controlled substances. We strongly urge all prospective customers to check their national laws prior to placing an order. Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. Proud sponsors of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey, this is Willie Nelson for NORML. And I smoke pot and I like it a lot. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer than alcohol. There's nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting those who smoke marijuana responsibly. To learn what you can do to help, contact NORML at NORML.org or call toll-free 888-67-NORML.
The Marijuana Agenda. Like the liberal agenda, but with profits. Ka-ching.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every Friday for the Reefer Rock Review with Herb Thrasher from 420radio.org. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
This is Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earleywine. Dr. Earleywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and author of numerous books and columns on cannabis science, culture, history, and medicine. Email your questions to Dr. Earleywine at 420research@gmail.com or call the Marijuana Agenda message line at 650-LEGAL-MJ. Now, here's your Cannabis Q&A.
All right, everyone, welcome to Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earleywine. I'm Russ Belville, and of course, as always, we have Dr. Mitch Earleywine joining us by telephone from Albany, New York. Welcome, Doctor.
Good to be on the show.
All right. There's an interesting lineup of topics for us to discuss today because it's kind of good news, bad news, good news, bad news. So let's start with bad news, or what might be bad news. There's this study that says from, I believe it is Ohio State University, that legal marijuana shops are causing an increase in property crimes. What did you make of this study?
There are a couple of quirks about this that I want people to be aware of when they're confronted with prohibitionists who are going to say this is somehow an argument for keeping cannabis illegal. Legal marijuana shops increase property crimes is in some ways kind of an unfair headline. If you look closely, yes, there are some property crimes in the adjacent communities around where legal marijuana shops show up. They're nothing like the violent increases in crimes associated with, say, liquor stores or things along those lines. And they also tend to be co-varying with lower socioeconomic status situations that I think are not properly controlled for in the way these data were analyzed. So if someone wants to get a legalized cannabis shop in your neighborhood, please don't shut them down with this argument. Because truth be told, right around, literally adjacent to the medical cannabis shops and legal cannabis shops is not the issue. It's just a little bit away, and it's hard to know how to interpret that until we can get a replication on this. We've had previous data suggest that this was not an issue, so I'm concerned that this may be, in a sense, a type 1 error, that the folks ran so many statistics, they may have found this in part by chance.
I was wondering also, would it be a confounding factor that when the states get around to regulating these shops, that you get a bunch of NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks, that prevent them from being located in certain areas, and they end up in more industrial or poorer areas, and maybe just the increase in economic activity generally is to blame for that?
Sad but true, and it really isn't a product of cannabis so much as attitudes about cannabis that have contributed to that. I really like the way you're wording that.
Well, let's take a look at the good news now. For a long time, we've been pointing out the relationship between access to cannabis, medical cannabis, and the decrease in the use and problems with opioids. Now, finally, National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, has come around to, at least as Tom Angel reports it, partially copping to that cannabis could help reduce the problem with the opioid epidemic. Is this as good a news as I think it is?
In truth, this may be the best news we can hope from any federal agency, but for them to actually say that marijuana could curb opioid addiction, we now have some pretty compelling evidence that this really is the case, both on the state level, nationally, and from surveys of individuals that Philippe Lucas has published from dispensaries up in Canada. What a surprise. If you're in opiate withdrawal, cannabis really does help. And I feel like that is far and away the most compelling mechanism. But we also see at the state level, medical marijuana states are markedly less likely to show opioid addiction and opiate-related deaths. And I feel like the deaths data really ought to hit home for folks. But if death doesn't matter to you, only cash does. We're also seeing Medicaid spending in the medical cannabis states is also lower, in part because of decrease in purchase of these opiates and a few other psychiatric meds. So please, let's take advantage of this. And if you get the chance, check out Paul Armentano's article at the NORML.org website on this. And it wouldn't hurt to remind anybody in Congress that this really is the best path outside this opioid addiction problem.
All right, let's get the message out there. Now, back to the bad news side of today's equation. According to a report in medicaldaily.com, it says smoking marijuana while pregnant may triple the odds of premature birth and low birth weight in infants. Any truth to that, Dr. Mitch?
As my friend Rick Grusha from the Washington University in St. Louis has been pointing out, there's some serious confounds here. And so, obviously, I don't want you and me ending up on a cross on the cover of People magazine, Russ. And we wouldn't recommend smoking cannabis during pregnancy because, something terrible might happen. Nevertheless, the idea that it would triple the odds of premature birth or low birth weight is probably a pretty drastic overstatement because we're talking about low socioeconomic status situations and a strange change over the years in people's willingness to admit to having used cannabis during pregnancy. So, again, we're not recommending cannabis as the effective anti-nausea medication it is known as. We're just saying odds are high. Premature birth and low birth weight are probably a product of nutrition and health care and prenatal vitamin consumption and things that are often associated with economics, rather than something as simple as consumption of a plant.
Well, that dovetails into stories I've reported on in other segments dealing with parenting, where we've reported, for example, in Alabama, where there'll be drug testing mothers and they find THC and then take the infants away. That would lead mothers to want to not go into prenatal care and visit their doctors. And then there you have your, lower birth weight babies because they're not getting the prenatal care because the prohibition scared them away. Is that a possibility?
In fact, it's more than likely, and unfortunately here we see another thing where cannabis is blamed for an outcome that is really the product of cannabis prohibition.
Mm-hmm. All right, now to my home state of Oregon, where the University of Oregon has put out a study that says legalizing cannabis here, Measure 91 in 2014, did little to change student use. My first thought here was, yeah, it's University of Oregon. They are already pretty much using as much as they can. What are your thoughts being a university professor and all?
Well, some of my friends at Oregon State sent me a big email with capital letters, duh, and an exclamation point. So I got to admit that cannabis legislation has relatively little impact in either direction, though, I want to point out, too. So it's rather unfortunate that I do hear some pretty sad tales via email of folks who are in, legal states or medical states and who still have university cops who are really left over from the fascist era and making a big deal out of something that certainly shouldn't be treated as any worse than alcohol consumption.
Yeah, and if you play football for the University of Oregon, you can smoke a blunt in your car and drive 115 miles an hour down the freeway, and they'll let you go with a warning. So I just can't imagine the use would have gone up any. Let's take a look at some bad news, going back to the bad news side of the equation here. A story out of Mike.com. States with medical marijuana see a greater rise in illicit and problem use. And what's going on in these numbers?
Well, so this is a little bit confused because some of the data were gathered prior to any actual changes in legal status. So the argument is, oh, hey, medical marijuana leads to illicit and problem use. In fact, what's probably more likely is states that happen to have a little more illicit or problematic use were more likely to pass medical marijuana laws. So we've kind of got a cart before the horse problem here. And then I do want to emphasize, essentially neither Washington nor Colorado have had any problems in teen marijuana use post-legalization, and that these data really do need to be interpreted with considerable caution, in part because these weren't randomly assigned. These states weren't suddenly told, hey, you're going to suddenly have medical cannabis laws. They chose to have this in part because they were different, and the fact that they have some problematic other drug use is a correlate of that, not caused by cannabis legalization.
So is it simple to say that, too simple to say that places that smoke a lot of pot legalize it rather than legalizing pot makes people smoke a lot of it?
It perfectly put.
All right, let's wind things up here with some good news, especially for those of you with some old, dumb mice. A new study shows that cannabis can reverse cognitive decline in mice, and of course, we're hoping this translates to humans, but give us your lowdown on this.
Well, so I do want to emphasize that these are what we would call microdoses, and that the THC is reversing cognitive decline, but only in the older mice. The young mice are showing some impairments walking through those poor mazes, as you might imagine. And I feel like we've got enough confirming evidence in animals now. It really is time to go for the human data. So everyone who wants to be randomly assigned to use cannabis for the next 20 years, please email me. No, I do feel like it's pretty obvious that the antioxidant effects of the cannabinoids are now contributing in a way that we can see is going to protect folks from some of the cognitive declines associated with aging. But the microdosing seems to be super important. So, as we've said in the past, a little dab will do you.
Well, that's good news considering that Mickey Mouse is 88 years old. So maybe we can, he's in California, Dr. Mitch. It's perfectly legal for Mickey, I believe.
You got it.
Well, thanks for joining us again for our Cannabis Q&A. And if you've got any questions for Dr. Mitch Earlywine, you can send them in to 420research@gmail.com, and we may use them on a future episode. We can keep your name private if you wish, but we can use them and get other people the information that you're seeking here on our Cannabis Q&A. Dr. Mitch, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
My hearty thanks.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. Subscribe now for free at mjagenda.com.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
Georgia. Hi, this is Willie Nelson. Alcohol prohibition didn't work in the 1920s, and marijuana prohibition isn't working today. It's time we stopped arresting responsible marijuana smokers. It's the fair thing to do.
For more information, contact NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Call toll-free 888-67-NORML or visit their website at norml.org.
The marijuana agenda, like the alcohol agenda. But a lot safer.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for Shark Sessions from The Marijuana Show. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Promoting the end of adult cannabis prohibition is easy because we have facts, science, reason, compassion, evidence, truth, and logic on our side. It's even easier when researchers catalog it all for us. Learn how to gather the facts on marijuana use, arrests, seizures, rehabs, drug tests, and more on this edition of Drug War Data Mining.
Today in the Drug War Data Mines, we are going on the data mining lightning round with polls and data from all across the United States and all sorts of demographic spectrums. Let's get started. First of all, a new poll from the University of New Hampshire Survey Center has some of the strongest support anywhere for marijuana legalization. The poll found 68% supported legalization, with only 27% opposed. What makes the finding even more striking is that more than half, or 53% of respondents in the same poll, identified drug abuse as the most serious issue facing the state. As the pollster noted, quote, "The public doesn't see marijuana legalization and the opioid crisis as the same issue," end quote. A recent poll of 1,000 registered voters in Illinois by the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute found that regulating and taxing marijuana like alcohol was favored by every segment of the electorate. Overall, 66% of Illinois voters support such a step, 45% strongly. In contrast, 31% opposed the idea, only 19% strongly. Support for legalized pot ranged from 74% in Chicago and 70% in the suburbs and collar counties to 54% in the rest of the state. A majority of Pennsylvania voters support marijuana legalization, according to a poll released by Franklin and Marshall College. The survey said 56% now support marijuana legalization, a 16-point increase from the last time the question was asked in 2016. A majority of independents and Democrats, 75% and 61% respectively, support legalization, but only 44% of Republicans do, according to the poll. People of color in New York City are more likely than white people to face conviction when arrested for marijuana possession following similar arrests, according to data obtained by Politico New York from the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. In New York City in 2016, 15.8% of marijuana possession cases involving white people ended in conviction and sentencing, while 32.3% of the cases involving black people and 30% of the cases involving Hispanic people ended in conviction. National data show that in 2010, 14% of blacks and 11.6% of whites said they had used marijuana in the previous year. And among people aged 18 to 25 years old, the greatest demographic of marijuana use, 33.4% of whites and 27.6% of blacks reported using marijuana in the past year. Massachusetts voters strongly favor judicial discretion over mandatory minimum sentencing and broadly support more aggressive reforms to the criminal justice system than are now being considered by legislators, a new Mass Inc. poll shows. By a nearly 2-to-1 margin, 53 to 27%, voters think Massachusetts prisons currently do more harm than good, making inmates more likely to commit new crimes rather than preventing future crime. A plurality, 42%, think there are too many people in prison in Massachusetts, while 23% say the number is appropriate. Just 10% say they are not enough. On a key issue affecting sentencing, 60% say the state's felony threshold should be raised to $1,500 from its current $250 level, while 36% oppose the change. Massachusetts has the third lowest threshold in the country and has not raised the dollar amount in decades. A new report from the Cannabis Consumers Coalition says that just as many women consume cannabis as men. This result is dramatically different from the other reports that usually find that men dominate the cannabis consumption crowd. CCC's survey had 53% of women consuming cannabis versus 42% for men. She noted that a Headset report found that 68% of men were cannabis consumers, which puts the ratio closer to 2-to-1. However, a Gallup poll from 2013 also reported a closer gap, with 8% of men and 6% of women saying they used cannabis daily. In a survey by BudTrader.com, an online medical marijuana marketplace, more than 150 current and former professional football players were asked for their experiences with various types of painkillers, including opioids and marijuana. Though marijuana is currently banned by the National Football League, 68% of the current and former players polled said they had used marijuana either for recreational or medical purposes during their career, while 87% said they would use it if the league allowed it, and 89% said they believed it would be an effective treatment for pain and other ailments. In the BudTracker.com survey, 91% of players said they had taken opiate-based painkillers like oxycodone, hydrocodone, and propoxyphene. Additionally, 45% of players said they had felt pressured into taking those drugs by team doctors, staff, and teammates in order to get back on the field. 68% say they had been concerned about their usage of painkillers, and 74% say they've had negative side effects from using them. This has been your Drug War Data Mining Poll Roundup. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be right back after this short break.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome.
It's time for Cannabis Facts about Alzheimer's from Robert Platshorn's thesilvertour.org. This message is supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com. A new Florida study in the journal Molecular and Cellular Neuroscience found that cannabis promotes the growth of healthy new brain tissue. It can slow the effects of Alzheimer's and may in fact be able to halt it entirely. A long-term study by Ohio State University's Professor Gary Wenk concludes that people who regularly use marijuana get Alzheimer's at a much lower rate than others. This was Cannabis Facts from thesilvertour.org, an educational nonprofit supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com.
The Marijuana Agenda, like the pharmaceutical agenda, without all the side effects, overdose deaths, insurance.
Side effects may include nausea, dry mouth, and constipation. Dry mouth, constipation, indigestion, and abdominal pain, which can occur without warning and may cause death.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for the UK Cannabis Chronicle from the UK Cannabis Social Clubs. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Welcome to the Midwest Cannabis Chronicle. Today, we catch you up on the latest news and speak with an expert from the great Midwestern region of America, from the Great Lakes to the Great Plains, including some of the latest states to embrace medical marijuana to the last states to resist it. Join us now to discuss hemp in the heartland with the Midwest Cannabis Chronicle.
Welcome to the Midwest Cannabis Chronicle. I'm Russ Belville. Joining us today is Dan Viets, who is the director of the Missouri affiliate of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russ.
I'd be remiss in not mentioning also Dan is a longtime board member of National NORML, so also brings a national perspective to the discussion. And are you working with other groups in Missouri we should give a shout out to?
Oh yeah, sure. We've got a whole alphabet soup of groups here. We've got the Missouri Cannabis Industry Association. We've got Show Me Cannabis. We've got 5 very active NORML chapters, and as you mentioned, they form the Missouri NORML affiliate. So there are a lot of groups. Of course, we also work with ACLU and various other like-minded organizations.
When we last left our attention on the state of Missouri, you were fighting to put marijuana reform on the ballot, and it came so achingly close to making the ballot. Yes. Give our listeners a quick remembrance of that, if they just to catch them up if they are just joining us in this program on what happened in 2016.
Well, as you say, Russ, we had a tremendous effort to make the ballot in November of 2016 with medical marijuana in this state. And unfortunately, the professional petitioning firm that we retained, PCI Consulting out of California, which had never failed in any of its efforts, both in marijuana reform and other efforts, other issues in any state, including Missouri. They'd never failed before, but they failed this time. And I don't really know how to explain that yet. But the fact is that they fell short of the required number of signatures in 1 out of the 6 congressional districts where our state constitution requires signatures to be gathered. And initially it was thought to be around 2,200 short, and then with all of the arguing we did in court, we whittled it down to maybe as few as 23 signatures, but there was no way to come back and add signatures. Our Constitution doesn't allow a second chance. So we immediately geared up to give it another shot in 2018, and the campaign is going very, very well, and we do expect to have medical marijuana on the state ballot in Missouri in November of next year. We have 25,000 signatures in hand, and all of those have been gathered by volunteers. So we've got a great effort going. We will engage the services of a professional firm at a later point. We will make certain that we don't repeat the problem we had last year. We'll have much greater accountability for how many signatures we have in each district so that we do not fall short again.
I understand the confusion lies in how the area around St. Louis was distributed as far as between county and city designations. Explain that a little.
Well, first, our state constitution may be unique in its requirement that we gather signatures from 6 of the 8 congressional districts in our state. And so any signatures from the other 2 districts just don't count. You've got to pick 6. You've got to get a minimum number of roughly 30,000 from each of those 6 districts. And we had twice the number we needed in congressional district number 1, which is basically the city of St. Louis, the core of the city. But we fell short in the area around St. Louis, which has parts of 3 different counties in it. And it is difficult for voters or for petitioners to know with certainty which district one lives in the St. Louis area. So that is an issue that we have to overcome this time.
The other issue I think of in criminal justice reform having to do with that area around St. Louis would be, of course, the area of Ferguson and all the unrest that occurred there. Is this in the area? I don't know the geography. Is Ferguson in the area where the difficulties occurred?
Yes, it is, and I'm fairly certain it's in District 2. I don't know that there was any direct impact from the unrest in Ferguson on our campaign, but you're correct. Ferguson is in that 2nd congressional district where we fell short.
All right, so looking to the future then, 2018 is on site for Missouri to go for a medical marijuana initiative. Tell us about the initiative and what the requirements would be.
Well, one of the things that we believe is absolutely essential to any good medical marijuana proposal, or for that matter, any broader legalization proposal, is that individual people be permitted to cultivate for their own use. And so that is an essential part of what we are proposing, that patients in this case would be permitted to cultivate for their own use. Now, in addition to that, it would set up, of course, a system of regulation and taxation. The regulation would consist of the state licensing people to cultivate, to process, and to retail, to dispense at retail medical marijuana with a doctor's recommendation, of course, basically as in most of the other 30 states, including Colorado specifically. Now, the plan that we have to accomplish that has been somewhat. I'll say that some potential donors have been waiting to see whether the General Assembly would do our work for us. In fact, there was a bill filed to put our initiative on the ballot without us having to gather signatures. Legislature declined to do us that favor, and we weren't counting on it anyway. The legislature, in fact, this year adjourned last Friday, and many of the legislatures across the country are adjourning around this time of the year. Well, here in Missouri, we had bills to legalize hemp cultivation, bills to expand availability of CBD, bills to legalize medical marijuana, and bills to legalize adult use of marijuana, and none of them passed. And again, that's not really a shock. That's not a surprise. Our legislature has been especially recalcitrant and reluctant to take any steps which could be seen as a positive reform from our point of view in the area of marijuana. Now, a few years ago, we did accomplish several legislative reforms, but there's no reason to think that's going to happen again, unfortunately. I think the legislature passed a CBD law because they hoped that would take the wind out of the sails for a real and much broader medical marijuana law. That has not happened. CBD is available in our state from only 2 licensed dispensaries, and there are only 50 people approved to receive it. So obviously that's not a satisfactory situation. We do intend to put medical marijuana on the ballot next November, and there's just no doubt that the voters are ready to embrace that. They may, we hope, in just a couple more years, they might be ready to embrace broader legalization, but that remains to be seen.
It is notable in your description of the CBD law operation in Missouri that you do have in-state access for the cannabidiol oil, whereas most of the cannabidiol states do not have that and require people to become interstate drug traffickers to be able to get the CBD oil. So I guess that is at least one positive coming out of Missouri.
It is, and the legislature deserves credit for that. In fact, when it passed, it had support from 90% of the members of the Missouri House and every single member of the Missouri Senate. Part of the reason for that is that the man who was then the leader of the Senate himself has a young child who suffers from seizures, from intractable epilepsy. And so that, of course, was a tremendous boost to the effort for CBD, but very little indication that the legislature is ready to go beyond that.
So moving forward with a medical marijuana initiative in 2018 that would include a patient's right to cultivate at home would also be a breakthrough recently, considering most of the states that have passed medical marijuana legislation have failed to include that right. Is that a deal breaker for you guys? You wouldn't move forward without home cultivation?
Yes, I think I can speak certainly for the board of the campaign committee, for Show Me Cannabis, for Missouri NORML. Yes, we are unanimous in believing that is an essential element of any acceptable medical marijuana law, is to allow patient cultivation. The only thing that stands between us and some kind of corporate takeover and some price fixing is the ability of individuals to cultivate for themselves, and there's just no logical reason to prohibit that. It doesn't make any sense unless you are an investor, unless your goal is to make as much money as you can off of the illnesses and the suffering of medical marijuana patients. It makes no sense to deny them that opportunity. But of course, you know that, Russ.
Well, yes, that's fantastic. It's wonderful to hear that you would stand by that. Are there any other ways in which the proposed Missouri initiative would differ from what we know or be similar to what we know in other medical marijuana states as far as condition lists, registries, and perhaps reciprocity for other states' ID cards?
Well, we do have the benefit, I should say we did have the benefit when we were drafting this measure of the experience of other states and the experience of patients from other states. And I've represented as a defense attorney many patients from other states who come through Missouri and hope, and in some cases I think they believe that because it was legal for them to purchase or grow cannabis in another state that they're protected here in Missouri. And that's not a far-fetched notion. There is, after all, in our Constitution a provision which says that the states shall respect the laws of other states. But the courts have interpreted that in a narrow fashion, and they're not going to compel one state to allow a patient from another state to do what would be legal in his or her state necessarily. So the point is that, yes, we do have a reciprocity clause in our state law, so that people who are in possession, in compliance with their own state's medical marijuana law will not be subject to arrest here in Missouri. One of the other very important aspects of this law, which should be a part of every state's laws, is protection for patients who use cannabis and who need organ transplants. And many states continue to deny organ transplants to people who test positive for cannabis. Now, that makes no sense. There is no medical or scientific basis for that. It would make more sense. Well, regardless of what would make more sense, there's no basis for that. There's no reason to believe that consuming cannabis makes a person less likely to successfully receive an organ transplant. So we have also included that provision, explicit and very clearly stating that no one shall be denied an organ transplant because they are a cannabis patient.
That is fantastic. And you also mentioned hoping for the future to move forward with adult use legalization. Is there perhaps a step in between there where Missouri might pursue reducing penalties or decriminalization at some level?
Well, in fact, Missouri did reduce penalties. I was involved in the Missouri Bar Association committee that rewrote and reorganized the entire Missouri criminal code, meaning all of the criminal laws in our state. And that's already been several years ago that we did that drafting work. And then we came to the legislature with this package, which was endorsed by the Prosecutors Association as well as by the Missouri Bar. And it included several positive revisions of the marijuana laws. And among them was the elimination of jail as a potential penalty for first offense only. Possession of our proposal was up to 35 grams, which is the misdemeanor amount in our state. The legislature cut that back to 10 grams, but nonetheless, they did keep that provision in there. So I do not believe that is decriminalization. That term decriminalization has, in my understanding of it, always been defined to mean, number one, no arrest, number two, no jail as a sentence, and number three, no criminal record. Well, the Missouri law only meets one of those criteria, and only on first offense under 10 grams for that matter. But one can still be arrested, although many police officers are not arresting people these days. They can, and some still do. And unfortunately, even if you get a fine or a type of probation that leaves you with no criminal conviction, it is still going to be a matter of public record while you're on probation, and it is technically still a criminal conviction if you pay a fine. So it's not decriminalization. And the answer to your question more directly, I guess, is yes, we could further reduce the penalties for possession. We could try that, but I wouldn't want to invest a great deal of time and energy in that because our legislature is just so stuck in the past. I mean, they're just not likely to, I think, go much farther. We were able to pass those changes because they were part of a much larger bill and, frankly, distracted the legislature, I think, from the marijuana provisions that were in it. You know, we also reduced the penalties for sales by 1/3, reduced the penalties for cultivation by 1/3, and eliminated, perhaps most importantly, in my opinion, eliminated what was called the prior and persistent drug offender law in Missouri. Now, that's the law that Jeff Mizanski was sentenced to serve life without possibility of parole for marijuana offenses under, and that will not happen again to anyone charged after January 1 of this year. There is no longer any prior and persistent drug offender law. So it did several good things, but again, I do not foresee the legislature going any farther. We're going to have to go to the ballot.
We will be supporting Missouri as you go to the ballot in what we hope is 2018 to further reform marijuana laws. Dan Viets, calling us out of Columbia, Missouri. Do you have any websites or contact information you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes, indeed. The most important one right now would be the campaign for medical marijuana in Missouri, and that is newapproachmissouri.com. I don't know why it's a com, but it is. Anyway, newapproachmissouri.com is the place where you can go to get updates on the medical campaign, and where you can go to volunteer to help gather signatures, and where you can go to donate money to the campaign, the mother's milk of politics, unfortunately. But yes, that's the most important one. Of course, Missouri Normal has a website under MissouriNormal.org. I think those are the two that are most important.
All right. Thank you, Dan Viets, for joining us today on the Midwest Cannabis Chronicle.
Thank you, Russ, very much. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. Subscribe now for free at mjagenda.com.
The Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville is proudly sponsored by the Marijuana Business Association. The MJBA, called by NBC News the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, is the fastest growing business association and the fastest growing industry in America. I've been working with the MJBA for years, and I personally invite you to join the MJBA. MJBA also publishes the popular MJ Headline News on Facebook and the MJNewsNetwork.com and Marijuana Channel 1 on YouTube. Visit mjba.net for more details.
This is Cannabis Facts from Robert Platshorn's thesilvertour.org, supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com. In 1937, the second most prescribed medicine, marijuana, was banned. It wasn't about marijuana. The paper, oil, and chemical industries lobbied to end hemp farming. No longer labor intensive, an acre of hemp produced more quality paper than 4 acres of trees. Plastics and fibers could be produced from a plant. Hemp can even produce 10 times the energy of today's ethanol. As marijuana prohibition ends, many states now allow farmers to again grow hemp. This was Cannabis Facts from thesilvertour.org, an educational nonprofit supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to process America's hemp crop at hempinc.com.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville with the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for Veterans of Compassion with the Veterans Cannabis Group. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show.
Encourage people to use less drugs.
I inhaled.
That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Radical Rant.
I've been thinking about the possibility of us having our 9th legalized state, the state of Vermont, which is moving toward a grow and give solution, similar to Washington, D.C., where Vermont adults would be able to cultivate 2 mature plants, 4 immature plants, and possess an ounce of marijuana. However, no taxed and regulated sales system. This, of course, is a boon to every illegal weed dealer in the state of Vermont. So the Illegal Weed Dealers Local 420 thanks you very much. It's always interesting to me that
we have these disparate ways of trying to legalize marijuana, where in New Jersey, their legislature passed this bill that has home grow but no sales, while in New Jersey, they've proposed a bill that's likely to pass and get to the governor there, who would sign it, the new governor who's expected to be elected, that legalizes sales but no home grow. It's particularly interesting in the state of Vermont, given that they've got Massachusetts and Maine right nearby that will have legal sales. So in addition to being a bonus for the illegal weed dealers in Vermont, it's also a boon to the taxpayers in Maine and Massachusetts, who will be reaping those tax benefits of people crossing the border to buy weed. And speaking of crossing the border, those people will be doing them in automobiles, I assume, most of the time. Motorcycles, perhaps, Vermont, likely bicycles. But anyway, the point of this rant has to do with the concept of stoned mayhem on the freeways. The word is that the governor of Vermont, Phil Scott, is considering signing this bill that has been passed by the Vermont legislature, but is holding back because he has concerns about public safety. He's worried about the possibility of increased problems in traffic, more fatalities and crashes, for example, due to the legalization of marijuana. And I just have to ask one question: why? I want to look at the statistics, first of all, in the state of Vermont, which, if you look at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, has consistently been a top 5 state most years for regular marijuana use. Monthly marijuana use by people aged 12 and older, Vermont was second in the nation this last period of data, 2013-2014. Second in the nation for the most use of marijuana. And if you look at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data, that goes all the way back to 1994, and you check out their rate of fatalities per 100,000 miles driven. That way you get a little bit of a comparison between small states like Vermont and big states like Texas, right? Urban states like New York and rural states like Utah, for example. In those ratings, last year data that we have at National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 2014, the same year that Vermont was second in the nation for most pot use, it was second in the nation for safest roads. It was the second safest place to drive. So I don't understand why the governor is concerned about marijuana and driving when his state has plenty of marijuana use and the second safest roads. Because I fear that people like Governor Scott and many others who have very little experience with the world of marijuana somehow believe that prohibition is working, that somehow prohibition is keeping things from happening that would be bad, and if we get rid of that prohibition, bad things will occur. Somehow they believe that legalization of marijuana invents cars and weed. Well, I got news for you, Governor Scott, and anybody else that might be listening to me. We've been driving. I know this is the dirty little secret that a lot of people in the marijuana movement don't want to let out, but I'm here to tell you that I've been toking and driving, and I know plenty of people, the majority of people I know, have done the very same thing, have smoked marijuana and then driven. I even can attest to people smoking marijuana while driving. And I know this is shocking for people that hear it, and I know that some will tell me, hey, I had to keep quiet about this and not give out the secret, but I feel we're better off if we're just honest about this and start addressing this concern about stone driving head on. If there was going to be any problem with marijuana and driving, we'd have seen it by now. We've seen rise and fall in the rate of people consuming cannabis in this country. We don't see a corresponding rise and fall in traffic fatalities. We see in the states that have legal marijuana or medical marijuana rates that are at the national average or below for fatalities per 100,000 miles. And we've had 20 years worth of medical marijuana to compare this data to. So there's not a big issue with toking and driving. The studies show that, correcting for age and gender, that drivers under the influence of THC are more likely to be a crash risk than sober drivers. Now, this isn't to say that a newbie should spark up the bong and get on the freeway and see how well they can do on the driving exam. But what we are saying is that people that consume cannabis regularly, especially those who are medical cannabis patients, develop a tolerance. The body develops a tolerance to the impairing effects of THC, and the mind is not impaired by cannabis in such a way as alcohol to give us a false sense of courage. People that are too high to drive know they are too high to drive and either don't drive or exhibit very, very careful tendencies when they do drive. If there'd have been a problem, we'd have seen it by now. We'd have seen massive wrecks coming out of Woodstock, for God's sake. So let's get over it. Let's just admit it. There is not a major problem with toking and driving. And what little problem there is, the police already have the tools to deal with. It's not as if no one gets pot DUIs now. That's all the time we got for Hour 1. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned live for Hour 2. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and SoundCloud. And follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.
Name something that gets passed around.
A joint.
A joint.
Now, streaming live on the Marijuana Agenda.
Oh, really? What are you people? On dope?
It's time for Toker Talk Radio.
Hey, this is great, man.
The voice of the Marijuana Nation.
Marijuana is listed as a Schedule I drug. That is absurd.
Call in now at 650-LEGAL-MJ. That's 650-534-2565.
What's to keep somebody from getting all potted up on weed and then getting behind the wheel?
Hey, man. Am I driving okay?
Toker Talk Radio is your chance to make your voice heard in the Marijuana Nation.
They're walking on their pants with their cap on backwards, listening to Enema Man and Snoopy Poop Dog.
Send that message with clarity that good people don't smoke marijuana.
Now let's get to Toking and Talking with your host, Russ Belville.
All right, welcome back, everybody, from beautiful legal Potland, Oregon, where the weather has returned to Portlandian proportions. All this week, supposed to be 50s and gray and cold. That was our we got teased. Last week was a tease. 70s and beautiful sunny days. Oh yeah, Portland, it's summertime. Nope. Back into line. Young podcaster. I'm not that young anymore, but what the hell. Hey, welcome to Toker Talk Radio. Coming up in this hour, all sorts of interesting stories. We're taking a look at the wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on in Florida medical marijuana in our A block right before our 20 after break. After the 20 after break, we're going to take a look at some money issues with respect to marijuana stocks and the program in the state of Minnesota that is bleeding money. Then in the C block, the last half hour of the show, we will take a look at the nation of Canada and how it is poised to dominate the international marijuana market. Oh, come on, America, get on the stick here. We can't let the Canadians beat us in weed, eh? And then in our closing segment, we'll take a look at a gummy bear overdose story and a little compare and contrast with other sort of drug overdose stories that are and are not out there in the media. But first, let's get to some stories here in the opening that have me shaking my head. Well, the first one doesn't have me shaking my head. I'm really happy about this first story. Coming out of Israel, where Reason reports that Israel has decriminalized marijuana possession. And this is fantastic news. Under the plan, which was endorsed by the public security minister, this was approved by the Israeli cabinet. And this was a conservative, by the way, a member of their conservative party that introduced this. People who are 18 and older caught with up to 15 grams of marijuana would be subject to a fine of 1,000 shekels. That works out to about $275 in U.S. dollars. They double that for a second offense. Third offense would be probation with possible treatment or additional sanctions like suspension of the driver's license. Criminal charges at discretion of police, available only after a fourth offense. Now, the good news here is that possession of 15 grams or less in Israel right now is currently punishable by up to 3 years of prison. But they've really been looking the other way recently. Since 1985, people caught with small amounts of marijuana are usually not supposed to be arrested on the first offense and decide whether or not to bring charges on the subsequent offenses. Arrests for marijuana possession in Israel fell 30% from 2010 to 2015. This is a population of 8.2 million people, and in 2015, they arrested 3,400 people for weed. Out of 8.2 million, 3,400. In comparison, in the United States, the population is 40 times as big, 40 times more people in America, but we arrested 575,000 people for marijuana possession. That's 168 times as many. Or by comparison, as a rate of population, we arrested over 4 times as many people for weed in America as they did in Israel. Now, in other news, this one coming to us from NASCAR, the National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing. Did I get that right? Did I win? I'm not sure. Is that correct, judges? Yeah, judge is telling me that is correct. But in NASCAR recently, we've got oh, shit. Watch out, guys. We got a story out of NASCAR here where the racer Carl Long, this was in a race in Kansas City, Carl Long was forced to strip the logo of a Colorado-based marijuana vaping company from his car Friday after NASCAR said it violated rules governing sponsorship and paint schemes. So he had the logo for a Colorado-based company called Veedwerks, and it was on his yellow number 66 car, but the NASCAR spokesman said it was never vetted, never approved, and when they found this logo on the hood, they had the crew members remove it before the car went to the track. According to Nobody, NASCAR officials rejected the cannabis logo because it was distracting from all of the beer, boner pill, pharmaceutical, and oil company logos in NASCAR. So, yeah, that's okay, not true. But still, come on, guys. This is the kind of discrimination that we are still facing, right? Where it's perfectly okay to have Budweiser and Coors Light and Miller and, I don't know exactly who's sponsoring in NASCAR anymore, but I've seen it in the past, and there's no reason legal marijuana shouldn't be in there. Show them how fast we really can go. We're back in just 2 minutes. Stick around.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Looking for the 420 friendliest way to visit beautiful legal Potland, Oregon?
I'm Lori Duckworth, inviting you to come stay with us at Delta 9 House and Studios.
You get your own private room with queen bed and access to our high-speed Wi-Fi, premium entertainment system, and more.
We'll even cook you breakfast. Look us up on Facebook at Delta 9 House.
That's facebook.com/Delta9House. Delta 9 House is booked through Airbnb and licensed by the City of Portland.
It's time for cannabis facts about teen drug use from Robert Platshorn's thesilvertour.org. This message is supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com. A recent survey by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control indicates that in states that have legalized medical marijuana, the rate of marijuana consumption among high school students has not increased. In fact, in legal states like Colorado, teen use has actually decreased significantly. It's simply no longer a big deal for teenagers in legal states. This was Cannabis Facts from thesilvertour.org, an educational nonprofit supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 2 weeks for the voice of the industry from the National Cannabis Industry Association. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Most of us pirates, we go on vacation to North Dakota, you know, because they've got a town called Argosville. Arr. What are you smoking there, boy?
It's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation. Call in now at 650-LEGAL-MJ.
All right, welcome back. And in this segment, I want to talk about the wink, wink, nudge, nudge that's going on in the state of Florida. There's a story coming out of WLRN in Miami, and Associated Press reporting on this one. Florida marijuana dispensary says new product not meant to be smoked. The Florida Medical Marijuana Dispensary says it is not violating state law by selling cannabis that could potentially be broken down and made into pot that can be smoked. Trulieve began selling its first whole flower cannabis product earlier this week that is meant for vaping. The buds in the vaporizer cup, however, could also be used in joints, pipes, or bongs. Vaping is allowed under state law, but smoking is prohibited. Trulieve CEO Kim Rivers said the company has issued warnings to patients that the product should only be used for vaping. So I love this story because it's like, this is the 21st century version of these pipes are for tobacco use only that you used to see in the head shops, right? Wink. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll only use this big, long, curly Q pipe for my tobacco use. Yeah, we'll load up some fine pipe tobacco in that and get right on it. So, it's like they're doing the same thing in Florida and any state that passes access to whole plant cannabis, but then foolishly tries to say no smoking of that whole plant cannabis is just kidding themselves and really just setting up some poor sap to be the test case of a vindictive sheriff or prosecutor that wants to go after somebody because they caught him smoking a joint. It's just insane. This is a legislature trying to mandate how medical care should proceed and trying to dictate to patients what is the best way for them to be able to consume their cannabis medicine. And it's all because, and I've mentioned this before on the show, the demonization of tobacco smokers is what's gotten us here to this position. It's been the demonization of just the act of smoking, that something is burning and you're inhaling that smoke is evil and must be opposed in every way. And it just ignores the fact that the smoking of cannabis for many patients is the most cost-effective and time-effective method for them to be able to medicate. It's just, first of all, if you allow vaporization, that's great. And I promote vaporization, right? The smoking of marijuana is not necessarily the healthiest way to consume it. I'm willing to concede that. The act of burning vegetable matter, whether it's a campfire or tobacco or cannabis, produces hydrocarbons that are not necessarily good for the lungs. And I'm willing to concede to the studies that show that we have a little bit more phlegm. I've got to cough up a little phlegm from time to time. That's a given. I'll accept that. But you always have to, in medical treatment, you have to weigh, it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? There could be side effects from taking an aspirin, but the benefit from taking the aspirin outweighs the side effect. There could be a side effect. There could be a risk of death from a surgery, but the benefit from the surgery outweighs that risk. And for so many patients, the benefits, the massive benefits they get from smoking marijuana far outweigh the extra cough or phlegm they're going to get from regularly smoking pot. Number one, the transportability of it. The transportability of it. So easy to just have some weed and some papers and roll a joint when you need to be able to inhale your medicine. You can find a lighter and papers just about anywhere. Even in states that have still maintained marijuana prohibition, you can find lighters and paper. And in many cases, that's a safer option for people that are, stuck in non-medical states. That's a safer option because of paraphernalia laws that criminalize having a pipe or anything else to smoke out of. And sometimes you can get away with the rolling papers. Regardless, vaporization requires an electricity source of some sort, a battery or a plug-in, and that's not always something that's available for people on the go. If a patient wants to go out in the wilderness or be away from a power source in some way, go out for a walk or a bike ride or something, and has a vape pen with one of those batteries, and those batteries end up dying, it's of no use. And these aren't, we're not talking like, AA, AAA batteries. You can just walk into a store and get some, although maybe I suppose some vaporizers have that option. But usually the vape pens we're talking about are the kinds that plug into the USB port and are rechargeable. And you just don't find those anywhere. So it's not always the best option for people. And furthermore, to have this law saying, you can have whole plant, but you can only vaporize it. Whatever you do, don't smoke it, just breeds a disrespect for that law. Just breeds a disrespect for it from the perspective of everybody knows we're violating the law. And it just makes us all a little hypocritical. So why even make that distinction in the first place? Why ban the smoking of cannabis? If you're going to give people access to the medicine, let them use the medicine in the way that's best for them under their doctor's supervision. The thing I fear about these kind of laws that get written to allow whole plant but ban smoking is that kind of concedes to our opponents that smoking is something that should be banned. That smoking is a bad thing and we ought to do what we can to ban it. And then when they find that banning it didn't work, that some people vaporized, but other people smoked, then they'll be compelled to get rid of the whole plant access. They'll be compelled to, we tried it your way. We couldn't stop people from smoking it, so now we have to ban whole plant access altogether. And then we're back into that box canyon where medical marijuana becomes something that fulfills the bottom line of the pharmaceutical companies that are going to make these cannabinoid extracts that you have to go to the store to get because you don't have access to that whole plant cannabis anymore. Now, already in Florida, they can't grow their own. So it'd be very easy to make an amendment to that, to the regulations to ban the access to the whole plant cannabis. Don't know how that'd work out since it's a constitutional amendment. Might be a high bar to clear, but the legislators are going to want to go that way. It's interesting how the legislature in Vermont has moved forward with home grow legalization without any sort of place to shop for it, but meanwhile has medical marijuana dispensaries at which patients can purchase whole plant cannabis. Don't think that's not going to get abused as well. While we got the wink and nudge going on in Florida, meanwhile up in Vermont, you're going to have every recreational consumer who wants to be able to buy some cannabis making really good friends with every patient they know. Hey, next time you stop into that, I'll tell you what, I'll buy your ounce of medicine for you if you split it with me, right? You get a free half ounce and you give a half to me, right? And what's to stop that from happening? And since Vermont is going to legalize marijuana and it's going to be legal to give marijuana to one another, what's to stop that from happening? All you're doing through this grow and give legalization in Vermont while maintaining commercial dispensaries in Vermont is subsidizing those medical marijuana dispensaries to be selling far more marijuana than they would have been. And people are then going to look at that spike They're going to say, hey, look, after you legalized, suddenly your medical marijuana patients were consuming a whole lot more medicine. Then we once again get that wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on, and Vermont's going to have to address that situation. Now, the good news in Vermont is legalization set up with a recommendation for a study commission, and then the study commission will take a look at those numbers. They'll say, look, we could have tax and regulate, or we could continue to turn a blind eye while people are shopping at the dispensaries, or going across the border into Maine, or going across the, a couple borders. You have to cross New Hampshire, but still, or going across the border again to Massachusetts, where they have legal sales. They'll start to recognize how much money they're losing through the lower taxed medical system in Vermont and through the taxes going out to Maine and Massachusetts. And that commission will recognize that, hey, we need to tax and regulate this stuff. And that legalization of home grow and possession without some sort of commercial regulations doesn't mean that commerce won't exist. Commerce will continue to exist the way it's always existed in Vermont and throughout the rest of the United States. And that's by home growers cultivating a few plants and selling them back and forth among their friends. And that can continue in Vermont. We're fine with that. And by legalization of home grow, you've made it impossible to stop that. But if that's going to be happening, if the commerce is going to be taking place, why not regulate it, allow businesses to be formed, to be regulated, inspected, and taxed, and contributing to the greater good in the state of Vermont, the greater society in the state of Vermont. If you allow the grow and give to be entrenched, who knows when it'll ever change. All right, that sound means that it is 4:20 here in the Pacific time zone. Time for us to take our union-mandated safety briefing. I'm feeling pretty safe today, so we'll just go with the joint. When we come back, we'll talk about marijuana and money.
At Herbie's Cannabis Seeds, we pride ourselves on bringing you the best quality seeds from the world's most respected cannabis seed producers, all at the lowest online prices. You can find Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. All cannabis seeds are sold as souvenirs and as a means of preserving cannabis genetics. Herbie's Seeds in no way intends to condone, promote, or incite the use of illegal or controlled substances. We strongly urge all prospective customers to check their national laws prior to placing an order. Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. Proud sponsors of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey, this is Willie Nelson for NORML. And I smoke pot and I like it a lot. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer than alcohol. There's nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting those who smoke marijuana responsibly. To learn what you can do to help, contact NORML at NORML.org or call toll-free 888-67-NORML.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me for A Sensible Future from Students for Sensible Drug Policy every other Tuesday here on the Marijuana Agenda. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Pod 2.0.
It's not your father's Woodstock weed.
It's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation. Call in now at 650-LEGAL-MJ.
Welcome back, everybody. And in this segment, we're going to talk about marijuana and money. So I got a lot of the former and not a lot of the latter, so I'll try to keep up. But this discussion has to do with investing. A lot of investment happening in the marijuana space these days. Of course, you hear all the touting from ArcView and New Frontier and BDS and all these other companies that talk about how, cannabis industry is the fastest growing industry, biggest industry, $6.7 billion industry, projected to be in the $20-30 billion range in just a few years, yada, yada, yada. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, we are certainly seeing massive amounts of growth in this industry. And if the home prices and rental prices in the Portland area and Denver and Seattle and every other city that seems to legalize, if those are in any indication, then yeah, there's certainly a big boom in cannabis. But right now, when it comes to the investment side of things, maybe not so much. There's a story here on The Motley Fool. That's Fool.com. It's entitled, "Surprise! The very first marijuana stock ETF has lost investors' money." It's been a dud so far, they say. Now, stock ETF is an investment fund that's traded like stocks, except it's a bigger fund that holds lots of stocks, commodities, bonds, that kind of stuff, just a big grouping of these. And the idea is to pool these investments so that an investor's not dropping all their money on 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 different companies. Instead, they're dropping into this fund that then is investing in lots of these companies in this space, kind of spreading the risk out sort of thing. An ETF is what they call it. And so this ETF, the very first one that was created, is called Horizons Medical Marijuana Life Sciences ETF. And if you want to look for this online, it's under the code TSX:HMMJ. Horizons Medical Marijuana Life Sciences ETF has actually lost value. The shares of the ETF have lost more than 4% from where they were initially priced on their first day of trading a little more than 5 weeks ago. On May 9th, they hit an all-time low. Now, this Horizons Medical has holdings in 16 medical marijuana companies, as well as ancillary companies that are associated with marijuana cultivation. For example, Scotts Miracle-Gro, they're SMG on the New York Stock Exchange. Scotts Miracle-Gro, lighting and nutrients and soil for cannabis growers. They're the third biggest holding, the third biggest company in the ETF for this Horizons Medical. So that's an example, right? It's not all medical cannabis companies, sometimes soil companies and other companies as well. So the problem that the investment experts are saying with this ETF, according to Motley Fool, is fundamentals still matter. They're saying that the weed industry is supposed to grow by 25% over the next 5 years, but according to the investment gurus here, many are starting from a small sales base, right? Only a few states, so smaller states. In fact, California has not come online yet, so the rest of the states pale in comparison. And they talk about, of course, it's still a federally illegal substance, so you've got all the restrictions of being able to distribute across state lines. You can't do that and can't sell internationally. We'll talk a little bit about that in our next segment. So the pot stocks aren't doing so well necessarily. Now, GW Pharmaceuticals, you can find them on NASDAQ at GWPH. GW Pharmaceuticals is doing okay. They got a $2.8 billion valuation, and they're getting some successful trials from Epidiolex. That's their CBD oil spray for kids with epilepsy. And, it's likely to get approved, although, still waiting on the FDA on this. But it's going to be a year or more before GW makes any money off of Epidiolex. And, still got the DEA they have to deal with as well. So, according to Fool.com, investors are paying about 40 times what Wall Street expects GW Pharmaceuticals to generate in profits by 2020. So they're spending 40 times more on it, and they're still 4 years away from expecting to make that kind of money. Another one out there, Aurora Cannabis, is the second largest holding in this ETF. It has this 800,000 square foot growing capacity that they're trying to come online with this to octuple how much growing capacity Aurora Cannabis is going to have. This is one of these Canadian medical marijuana producers, and they're just one of the few that are profitable there. A lot of these stocks are based, on the inflated bubble that we still have, that everybody's all high on, high on the cannabis industry, but not recognizing that as much as the growth is predicted, we still face a ton of hurdles that make it hard to run a profitable business. The IRS 280E problem, as far as not being able to deduct, cost of goods sold that most businesses can deduct and other deductions. We have the problem of not having access to banking that presents all sorts of hurdles to these new companies. So everybody's jumping on the bandwagon, hoping this is the next .com bubble. This is the next big thing, but need to be cognizant of the fact that, there's still a lot of things to overcome. And one example of this comes to us from the state of Minnesota. Minneapolis Star-Tribune has an article entitled "Minnesota Medical Pot Providers Run $11 million in the Red. The continuing losses that hint at systemic problems with the state's tightly regulated program, despite a recent expansion that allowed thousands more patients to buy the medication." So Minnesota is the perfect example, and you could have predicted this was going to happen, right? Contrast that to the state of Oregon, where I'm talking to you from. We've had medical marijuana since 1998. There has not been a year that our program hasn't run a surplus. $1 million surplus they have year after year because we didn't have super tight regulation like this. Minnesota is one of these medical cannabinoid states. You can't get whole plant cannabis, has to be vaporized, has to be tinctures and oils and sprays and pills. It's all you can get. And the condition list is extremely restrictive, although, like they said, they've expanded it recently. But it's just really a far too over-regulated program. And thus it costs too much to run for how few patients can actually jump through those hurdles. Now, I don't care, right? Hey, I don't care if keeping people out of cages for using marijuana, especially as medicine, costs the state money or makes the state money. I don't care. You do it because it's the right thing to do. But this doesn't look good. And it should serve as a warning to legislators, if they were smart, that are looking at medical cannabis regulations to just ease up. You keep wanting to treat this like it's PCP, porn, or plutonium, and it's just pot. People have been smoking it in your state for years, and they're going to continue to smoke it in your state, regardless of what kind of medical marijuana law you put together. And you put together these strict, over-regulated laws, the only people you hurt are the most desperate. The only people you hurt are the most vulnerable people. A guy like me, healthy pot smoker, maybe I could say I use it for chronic pain or for anxiety or for sleep disorders, but I just like to smoke pot. But I could make a medical argument for any of those things. You're not going to stop me. I'm going to find a guy. If it's illegal, I came up in Idaho. I'm going to find a guy. I'm going to find somebody. I'm going to find a way to get some weed. I'm going to smoke it. And it doesn't matter if you have absolute prohibition, whether you have medical marijuana or whether you legalize the stuff. I'm going to be just fine. It's that guy in the wheelchair. It's that lady going through chemo. It's that kid with epilepsy. They can't go find a guy. So when you make these overly restrictive programs, those people are going to jump through the hoops. They can't find a guy. They don't have a choice, and they're severely ill. They don't have a choice. They're going to do everything it takes. They're going to sell whatever it takes. They're going to move if they have to. They're going to do what it takes to get on that program. But so few of them will actually be able to jump through those hoops. That's why Minnesota is losing $11 million. Meanwhile, the people who can't jump through the hoops but can find a guy or can go to another state or can get it somehow, they're not helping your program, and they're still getting the medicine they need. And those that can't jump through the hoops and can't get the medicine, well, they're just dying. They're just suffering. And why should they? Look, we've had medical marijuana on the West Coast for 20 years in California and going on 19 here in Oregon and Washington. And look, the sky didn't fall. And the more people that get access to it, the better. It reduces your state welfare rolls. It reduces your state medical costs. You don't have to pay for all the prescription pills that they need to take if they had access to cannabis. It's really a win-win scenario. The more people you allow into the program, the easier you make it to get into the program. People who generally want to follow laws, people who are sick and people who are disabled, it's not like they want to be pot criminals. They want to be interstate traffickers. They want to risk going to jail. Give them decent enough hoops, low enough hoops to jump through, and they'll do it. They'll follow the regulations. They want to be legal if they can, but not if you're going to make it ridiculously overregulated. And in fact, that is even starting to spread here to Oregon. Recently, the Oregon legislature made a bunch of changes to our medical law, like you can't register a garden where there's no street address. I happen to know one of the greatest medical cannabis growers of all time, a guy named John Sajo, works tirelessly for patients, has been in this state for decades. He goes back to the 80s when they failed with the legalization back then, going up against Ronald Reagan and Just Say No and still fighting. This guy, he lives in the middle of nowhere. Like, I got invited to go to his house one time, and I said, well, what's the address? He goes, well, it doesn't have an address. Let me tell you, it's like, follow U.S. Forest Road 8. Go a fur piece until you find the big log, and then take a right. I mean, this guy lives in the middle of nowhere and produces pounds and pounds and pounds of medicine for free for patients year after year. They're not going to let him register a grow site because it doesn't have a street address? This is insanity. It's not PCP, porn, or plutonium. It's just pot.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
Georgia.
Hi, this is Willie Nelson. Alcohol prohibition didn't work in the 1920s, and marijuana prohibition isn't working today. It's time we stopped arresting responsible marijuana smokers. It's the fair thing to do.
For more information, contact NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Call toll-free 888-67-NORML or visit their website at norml.org.
The Marijuana Agenda. Like the liberal agenda, but with profits. Ka-ching.
I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 4 weeks for the Celebrity Marijuana Zone with Steve Bloom from celebstoner.com. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Hello, Mr. Man. Hi. I'm working. I'm sorry. No food till this is done. It's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation. Call in now at 650-LEGAL-MJ.
Welcome back, everyone. 38 after the hour. Just changed. Welcome back to the program. We're talking about home state of Oregon here, where they're making some major changes to the medical marijuana program. And it's just, It's frustrating, and it's kind of inevitable in some fashion. Let's recall that medical marijuana is an exception to prosecution for marijuana, right? That was the whole point of it, was let's get the patients, get the sick and dying off the battlefield of the war on drugs. If anybody deserves to be first in line to not be prosecuted, it should be the patients. Completely agreed. But that idea was we had to do that because there was this prohibition that was affecting people. Well, if you end that prohibition to some extent, if you legalize marijuana for all adults, to some extent, you also don't need as much of an exception anymore in a lot of people's mind. It's like, okay, if everybody can have weed, if everybody can grow 4 plants in their house and everybody can have an ounce on them and everybody 21 and older can go to a store, then what's the point of having the medical marijuana anymore? Now, there's obviously a few problems with that thinking. The first problem with that thinking is people under the age of 21. You got to keep a medical marijuana program because you can have young people, especially when you're talking about guys that are 18, 19, and 20 who can sign up for the military, go overseas, have a traumatic brain injury, lose a limb, get post-traumatic stress, come home, and what? You're not going to let them smoke weed? Come on now. Under legalization, you got to be 21, right? Sorry, here, have some tea. Oxycontin, more like it. There's no reason. That's one of the main reasons I see that you got to keep a separate you got to keep medical marijuana in some fashion to deal with the younger patients. Absolutely got to deal with that. But number two, it's absolutely a certainty to me that medical marijuana patients are going to need greater privileges, greater limits, if you will. If the prohibition for all adults was removed without limits, if anyone 21 over could buy as much weed as they want, grow as many plants as they want, within a reasonable limit, like not a farm, but, dozens of plants, sure. If anybody could do that, then now you've got really a hard time making the argument you need a separate medical program. But the legalization we have isn't really full legalization yet. It's still extremely limited to just an ounce and 4 plants. And that's not 4 plants per person. That's 4 plants in a household. And that's not going to work for even a single marijuana patient in many cases. 4 plants isn't going to work, much less a family where maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people have illnesses that need cannabis treatment. So long as there's going to be ridiculously low limits on the adult use of marijuana, there's got to be a medical program and medical allowances that allow for greater limits. And to the same extent, there needs to be that for potency in certain products like edibles and tinctures and such. If they're going to make these low limits on the serving size in a chocolate bar, can only be 10 milligrams of THC, which I got 10 milligrams of THC in my little finger right now. So not gonna do a thing to me. I would need to eat like 4 or 5 of them chocolate bars before I'd start feeling something. So long as that's the case, then you got to have medical on the side for having greater limits in that respect. But then you run into another sort of problem, and that's the problem of so long as medical has greater privileges, people on the adult use side are going to want to skip over the line, sneak over the other side and take advantage of the greater benefits, the lower taxes, the higher potency, the greater limits, and so forth. So now you get that cost-benefit analysis. How much is it being abused versus how many people are being helped? Is it such a big deal if some 18, 19, 20-year-old recreational consumers manage to find a way to get a medical marijuana card and smoke some weed? Is that such a terrible evil that we need to then hurt patients that are actually benefiting, the ones that actually need the 24 plants? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. When you make restrictions, you don't hurt the people trying to skirt the restrictions. You don't hurt the 18-year-old, 19-year-old trying to get weed. They'll find a way to get weed. You do hurt that paraplegic who's needing the 12 plants to cultivate to press into oil for massive amounts they need to deal with a bout of chemotherapy or whatever. So it's, life's full of trade-offs. And to me, I think, hey, a little bit easier access for an 18-year-old kid to get some tested weed that's been taxed, or at least a little, or been inspected some. And if that's the cost that allows the the really sick person to still be able to have a dozen plants or a couple dozen plants, so be it. Of course, that's not a very easy political argument to make. It's okay if teenagers are smoking pot. Sick people need medicine, right? It's a hard argument to make, but it's the right one. It's the right one to make. And it's these weird, it's like lately we've been talking about how these days as cannabis consumers, we look forward to the days when our children and grandchildren will say, Grandpa, did they really used to lock people in cages for cannabis medicine? Right? But there's really a bunch of those steps in this process. The next generation after that is going to look back at our generation of legalization and go, did they really limit people to an ounce and just 4 plants? Why? Well, we have to explain that because there's still places where it's illegal. And if we don't limit people in the places where it's legal, they'll supply the people in the places where it's illegal. As if they're not already. Like, that's the other thing. Like, we get one of the arguments for, again, not letting John Sajo grow his free medical marijuana for dozens of patients in a place that doesn't have a street address. One of the arguments is, well, these guys are staking out places in the rural areas and they're diverting water and they're not John. I'm not saying John does. He's best a guy as far as grower and all that. But, the argument from the opponents is, well, they're going to divert it to the black market. We've got all these pounds and pounds of marijuana that has made its way across Interstate 80 in Utah. And we found all this weed in Nebraska. It came from Oregon medical growers, blah, 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 blah. That's their argument, right? And of course, the response is like, so Oregon never distributed weed east before? Only when medical happened, this started, right? It's not gotten worse. It's about the same as it's always been. But now that it's attached to something that's a change in people's lives is freaking them out. And then there's the consideration when you talk about the evolution here, because we're going through these steps where we're in this partial legalization because there's still prohibition in places. What happens when eventually, and I think it's going to come sooner than we think, the federal government gives up on cannabis, removes it from the Controlled Substances Act, and all the states have some form of legalization. Now imagine that. The legalization may be different, might be, nice and easy going in the West, might be really strict in the Midwest, no home cultivation, only dispensary sales. Maybe in the East, it's no home grow, or no sales, but home grow is allowed. There might be a patchwork of different legalizations, but imagine the United States, when it's legal in all the states. And at that point, what becomes the rationale for 1 ounce limits and 4 plant gardens or 6 plant gardens? Like here in California, I'm a criminal if I have 7 plants, but in Oregon, I'm a criminal if I have 5 plants. But why? What happened in between those 2 plants there? And much like we've seen a homogenization of our alcohol laws, where pretty much, well, across the country, you got to be 21. We have a nationwide 21 age, and pretty much similar alcohol laws. Like most places, your bars close at 1 or 2 in the morning. Some places they go till 4. Other places they never close. But you can usually come up with a baseline like, 1 in the morning, the bars will be closed, right? Most places have liquor stores that you have to go to rather than buying it in the store. Although there's a lot of them where you can just buy liquor in the store, but generally they're kind of homogenized, right? So are we going to end up with a blanket kind of homogenization across the United States where 1 ounce becomes the default? Everybody's just used to it being 1 ounce because that's what everyone legalized, other than Washington, D.C. and Maine so far, 2 ounces and 2.5 ounces respectively. But does that become the standard? Because I see 6 plants is becoming the standard now. Why? What's the magical about 6 plants or 5 or 8, right? Did anyone do any analysis on this, or is that just a number picked out of the air? And is that going to become our standard across the nation? And if it does, then you got to ask, well, why? Because, like, if all the states allowed for home cultivation of 4 to 6 plants, why would you keep a limit of it being just 4 to 6? Because having more than that would mean you'd grow commercially. Well, if you did grow commercially, to whom are you selling? I mean, these are the things I think about. Like, moving forward, what is going to be the next weird situation we deal with? The unintended consequences of cannabis legalization. There's a story I wanted to get to, and I rambled a little too far to get to it in this segment, and we'll talk about this a little bit, perhaps in a future episode. But it's a story out of Vice News, and I'm loving Vice. Vice News talking about how Canadian medical marijuana producers are becoming the first dominant force in the international marijuana market. And yeah, there's an international marijuana market, aside from the one we've all dealt with, but a legit market, we should say. But, places, first of all, Canada and the Netherlands are the only, according to this Vice story, are the only 2 nations that have approved the cultivation of medical marijuana for export. And they're currently exporting it to places like New Zealand, Australia, Chile, Brazil, Croatia, other countries that have medical marijuana programs. And currently one of the firms negotiating with Germany, looking to be the provider of medical cannabis to Germany. And it just frustrates me that Canada is getting to be first in the market at this, when we grow so much better weed in the United States. Yeah, I said it. I dropped the gauntlet. We grow such good weed in the U.S. I'm not saying Canada's weed is bad by any measure. No. Just saying we got lower latitudes and more farmland and more diversity. And there's no reason American cannabis could not dominate these markets, aside from our federal government keeping it in this ridiculous Schedule 1. We shall see. But Canada, we're watching you, and we're going to be on your heels. All right, stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple minutes to close up shop with a story about cops, gummies, and New York.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome.
It's time for cannabis facts about Alzheimer's from Robert Platshorn's thesilvertour.org. This message is supported by our donors and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com. A new Florida study in the journal Molecular and Cellular Neuroscience found that cannabis promotes the growth of healthy new brain tissue. It can slow the effects of Alzheimer's and may in fact be able to halt it entirely. A long-term study by Ohio State University's Professor Gary Wenk concludes that people who regularly use marijuana get Alzheimer's at a much lower rate than others. This was Cannabis Facts from thesilvertour.org, an educational nonprofit supported by our donors, and Hemp Inc., a public company poised to lead America's hemp revolution at hempinc.com.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
It's like I picked the wrong week to quit smoking.
Learn more at mjagenda.com.
I'm Russ Belville with the Marijuana Agenda. Join me every 2 weeks for the Cannabis Minority Report from the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Learn more at mjagenda.com/about.
Jag heter David, PKA Dirtball. Vi ska röka hela tiden, alla år.
It's time for Toker Talk Radio, the voice of the marijuana nation. Call in now at 650-LEGAL-MJ.
That one goes out to all our Swedish listeners. As we close up shop here at the Marijuana Agenda, one more story to get to, and this one comes to us from the Facebook page of the Ramapo, New York, or Ramapo? Ramapo? I'm going to say Ramapo. It sounds like Ram, a police officer. Ramapo. I'm going with it. The Ramapo Police Department on their Facebook page posted the following. On Sunday, May 14th, 2017, at approximately 5:30 p.m., RPD was called to the emergency room at Good Samaritan Hospital for a reported 10-year-old that overdosed. Upon the arrival at the hospital, the investigating officer was advised that the 10-year-old had ingested some sour gummy candy containing 250 milligrams of THC. Tetrahydrocannabinol is a compound in marijuana responsible for the psychoactive effect. The child's father, a 37-year-old male from Spring Valley, New York, was arrested and charged with endangering the welfare of a child. The child was treated and released from the hospital. At this time, there is no evidence that the father or child had a prescription to legally possess this item. RPD is continuing with this investigation. With the recent legalization of medical marijuana in the state of New York, RPD wants to remind everyone that just as any other drug, prescribed or not, there are precautions that must be taken to protect others, especially young children. Please keep your medicine out of the hands of children and teens. Know what you have and where it is always. Okay, so a few things about this. Number one, I love the concluding paragraph. I love the cop saying, hey, it's medicine, and like any medicine, keep it out of the hands of your kids. That's a fair thing to say. Thank you. That's good. I like that. Now the rest of it. Prescription to legally possess the item. There is no such thing as a prescription for medical cannabis. It is a recommendation. Please adjust your terminology. Now, finally, the first paragraph. This is the one that gives me a problem because they say at 5:30 p.m., the cops were called to the ER at the hospital. So somebody at the hospital, upon treating this child for the gummy THC problem, then called the cops. Got a problem with that. You want to ensure that the next parent doesn't take their kid to the ER if they get into the marijuana gummies? This is how you do it. See, the first responders, the medical treatment personnel, should not be narking on the patients that come in having problems with their ingestion of drugs. It's counterintuitive. It just guarantees they don't want to come see you next time. And for medical professionals, you all swear to this oath, first do no harm, right? Reporting someone to the police for overdosing on a drug, and I'm not just talking about the kid with the gummies here, any drug, any overdose, reporting them to the authorities is just a great way to see more harm. So I don't understand what they're doing in Ramapo there at the Good Samaritan Hospital, calling the cops for a kid who'd gotten into the marijuana gummies. And especially, the child was treated and released, which all of the kids that get into the marijuana gummies are, right? It's not a cool thing. I'm not saying that, hey, get your kid loaded on the gummies. But I am saying, as far as terrible accidents your kid could have, ingesting the marijuana gummies is way down on the list of scary, okay? It can be unnerving. They'll get vertigo. They get extremely lethargic, sleepy, drooly maybe. You give them keep them hydrated. You give them a little bit of food. You'll let them sleep it off, and they're fine. So it's not the scariest thing in the world. So now, in this, they say, in this case, when I was looking up the report on it, they reported how the man is going to be, or it's in this right here, was arrested and charged with endangering the welfare of a child. And this is something I want to get into because you always get this endangerment of a child when they're caught with illegal drugs and the kids are getting into them. But rarely do you see this when they're caught with legal drugs. So the first thing I did when I saw this story this morning is I did a Google News search on child endangerment prescription to see, could I find stories where some kid got into the oxys or the fentanyls or the whatever, the benzos, and then do the police then rush to charge them with child endangerment? I found this story to Rankin County, Mississippi. Toddler got into mother's prescribed medicine. Child's recovering after swallowing a pill. And the Rankin County Sheriff's Office told 3 on Your Side the child was taken to Blair E. Batson, where he appears to be okay, but is being kept overnight for observation. Investigators said the mother was at home when the accident happened. There's an investigation underway to determine if child neglect played a role. DHS is aware of the incident. There's an investigation. They didn't rush to throw child endangerment. Boom. What? We caught you with a drug. Boom. Child endangerment. No, prescription drug. Well, maybe there was some neglect involved. We'll have to see. It's all up in the air. We don't know yet. But every other story I found on that Google News search of child endangerment prescription, I found a lot of them, people charged with child endangerment, where they found prescription drugs. But they'd also found cocaine, or they'd also found meth, or they'd also found weed, or they'd also found that the prescription drugs weren't legal for them. They were illicit. People with their legal prescription drugs, their kids getting into them, couldn't find a single story of child endangerment. Thanks for joining us, folks.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and SoundCloud. And follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
Time flies when you legalize. We'll be back tomorrow with more news and interviews you can use for the cannabis community. I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.